Okay. Okay. This is a lecture on reform and the Second Great Awakening. I propose to talk about the Second Great Awakening and what this religious movement meant for the reform movements, the building of canals and railroads, the middle class families and their strategies to cope with the separate spheres that are set out as an ideal, the decline of family size, and the reform movements of the era that we haven't talked about yet. And then we'll conclude by talking about feminism and the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. All that is to sense of what's important and what is the meaningful in the there you go. Okay, so I'm going to turn this off just a second. There we go. So the Second Great Awakening was led by Charles Grandison Finney, who proclaimed that man is a moral free agent, that we don't have a proclivity toward sin or no sin, but we are neutral. We are a moral free agent. That sin itself is something always that can be avoided. It's a personal choice that you need to resolve to stop sinning yourself. But when you perceive sin in society, is you go out and convince others to stop sinning, that you have that responsibility. So this grew into the revival and reform movements of the day, especially temperance, which gave especially rural Americans, Protestants, women who were active in the temperance movement, a place they could go to say that you were trying to develop those positive character traits. You can choose not to drink. You can choose not to sin. And so the Second Great Awakening of the 1830s and 40s that was especially strong in the Burdover district of upstate New York helped to catalyze the reform movements of the day. So here's a look at the roads and canals and the earliest railroads as they developed in the early 19th century. Middle-class families are noted for trying to live up to the ideals of the separate spheres case. There's a difference in understanding between gender, which is what society says gender difference means, versus sex, which is the biological difference between masculine and feminine, between male and female. Gender is socially prescribed norms, and sex is just the biology of sexual difference. The separate spheres that developed in the 19th century have to do with home, that home is gendered female, that women run the household and men go off to the acquisitive, selfish world of work. That work is outside the home. Whereas before, it would have made no sense to say there should be a separation. You work where you live. That was the case of farmers and shop owners. So that home becomes part of this gendering of space for men and women. And so motherhood and childhood itself become vocational strategies of the middle class. They became places where the middle class could replicate themselves and their values. So motherhood kind of emerges as something that the middle class has aspired to. Many times we hear the phrase a self-made man, but that is also oftentimes reliance upon the labor of a mother or a sister to sacrifice their earnings to the family so that a self-made man can emerge. So there was a decision to have fewer kids, and the family resources were focused on the raising of the brother or the son. Just the average number of children native born in the urban north demonstrate that smaller families were the norm, and few people were deciding to have fewer children to conform to this notion that it takes more resources to raise a good Republican son in the market revolution world of the mid 1830s, 40s, and 50s. Okay, the reform movements that were helped catalyzed by the Second Great Awakening. I have transcendentalism listed here under Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau and Margaret Fuller, that there's a level of meaning. If the transcendentalists believed that you could contemplate your soul in nature, you could be self-reliant, you could live in nature, you could connect to the Brahman, the life force that animates all living things. And there's a level of understanding of contemplation of nature that transcends logic, transcends my ability to communicate it to you, that we all want to try to reach that level of understanding, but there's no way that I can communicate to you what it is like to be transported by nature, and that this level of understanding transcends human logic. The 1830s was the first decade of vegetarianism, that Dr. William Graham invented a graham cracker that helped to make vegetarianism achievable during his lifetime. There were utopian communities of the Oneida silverware manufacturing community, of Amana appliances, that attempted to go out into the world and show the world how to organize a perfect selfless society of utopian communities. These rarely lasted more than a few years, and they all ended in failure. But those two communities lasted into the present day. Dorothea Dix was the principal reformer of prison reform, of mental health facilities reform, who internalized that mental health and committing crimes were needed to be eradicated, needed to be bred out of people, taught out of people, that people could learn to look at mental illness as a disease as opposed to something that were required, like exorcism or something to get rid of the demon that possessed you. It wasn't that way at all, according to Dorothea Dix. It was something that could be fixed. Character is perfectible, is you can choose to not be a criminal, and therefore you could avoid criminality in the future. The education movement of Massachusetts educational reformer Horace Mann meant that if we build better schools, if we educate children so that they go to school and become better people through education, that is something that the society has a general interest in. So education became Horace Mann's first in the 1840s attempt at public schools. Public schools, according to Mann, would be places where workers would learn to be literate workers and literate citizens, and you could teach people to obey a clock by requiring that students show up at a certain time in the morning. You could require workers to obey a clock too. Okay, that's it. The the Seneca Falls Convention. A very tiny reform movement was the women's movement of the 1840s. And they held their first convention at Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. They were led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, and they published a declaration of sentiments that modeled itself after the Declaration of Independence and had a wide range of interests for how treating women as partial human beings ended up costing men and women an essential part of their humanity. So there were different kinds of feminists that emerged. Feminists of difference who would say that women needed to have more power and more rights because men had screwed up things for 4,000 years, and it was time to give women a chance. And feminists of equality who believed that women were equal to men and were entitled to equal rights and equal civic rights because they were equally human to men. So that was a split in the feminist movement. Regardless, these feminists demanded, and by the way, most of these feminists were feminists of equality, that for the most part, they subordinated their interests to the abolition movement. Everyone that attended the Seneca Falls Convention was already an abolitionist. So it was natural that in the intermingling of their two movements, there would be one that would come to the fore. And it was understood that the fate of the slaves was something that could be accomplished by continuing to agitate on the abolition movement. So it was explicitly subordinated. When the slavery was abolished during the Civil War, then women came back and demanded, for instance, the right to vote. So anyway, that's what I did. Here you see a picture of the Seneca Falls Convention and a cartoon making fun of them. Okay, I hope you find some of these reform movements inspiring. Have a good day.